Most people picture Rio de Janeiro as a paradise. It is the marvelous city, a place of golden beaches, Christ the Redeemer, and vibrant culture. But like any place where the sun shines that bright, the shadows cast are incredibly long and incredibly dark. In the early 1990s, across the bay from the glamour of Copacabana, in the gritty, working-class city of Niterói, something monstrous was hunting. It wasn't a gang, and it wasn't the drug cartels that usually dominate the headlines coming out of Brazil. It was a single man, a phantom who moved through the streets with a Bible in his mind and absolute carnage in his heart. He was a predator who targeted the invisible. He hunted the children that society had already forgotten, the street kids, the boys trying to sell candy at traffic lights to buy a meal, the ones who wandered the favelas, unsupervised. When these boys vanished, the police didn't launch massive manhunts. The media didn't break into scheduled programming. They just slipped away, one by one, swallowed by the humidity in the forest. But if the city didn't notice them leaving, they would soon be forced to look at what was left behind. Because the man taking them wasn't just killing them, he was consuming them. This is the story of Marcelo Costa de Andrade, a man whose crimes were so gruesome, so steeped in blood and twisted theology, that he earned a moniker that still terrifies Brazil decades later, the Vampire of Niterói. To understand the horror of this case, we have to look at the sheer psychological contradiction of the killer. Marcelo wasn't a raving lunatic screaming on a street corner. He was quiet, he was polite, he was deeply, obsessively religious. He attended church services almost daily. He listened to gospel music. In his mind, he wasn't a monster. He was an agent of salvation. He operated under a terrifying delusion. He believed that by killing young boys, he was sending their souls directly to heaven before they could grow up and be corrupted by the sins of the adult world. He thought he was doing God's work, but the methods he used were straight from the deepest pits of hell. The terror reached its peak in late 1991. By December, over a dozen boys had likely already fallen victim to him, their bodies left in the dense undergrowth of the surrounding areas. But on December 16th, the pattern changed, and it changed because of two brothers, 10-year-old Altair and his younger brother Ivan. It was a Monday. The boys were in the center of Niterói, navigating the busy streets. They were poor, living in a rough neighborhood, just looking for an opportunity, perhaps a free meal or some loose change. That's when Marcelo spotted them. He approached them with the demeanor of a kind stranger, a potential benefactor. He didn't use force, he used manipulation. He spun a story that sounded strange but lucrative to two hungry kids. He offered them money, about 4,000 cruzeiros, if they would help him perform a religious ritual. He played on their trust and their need. Enticed by the promise of cash, the brothers agreed. They boarded a bus with Marcelo, leaving the safety of the crowds behind. They traveled away from the city center, toward a desolate stretch of highway near the Barreto Viaduct. As they got off the bus and walked into the heavy vegetation, the atmosphere shifted. The kind stranger began to change. The noise of the city faded, replaced by the buzzing of insects and the terrifying isolation of the woods. When they reached a secluded spot near a deserted beach area, the trap snapped shut. Marcelo made his move on the younger brother, Ivan. When the boy resisted, the saint vanished and the beast emerged. Right there, in front of his terrified 10-year-old brother, Marcelo attacked Ivan. The violence was sudden and overwhelming. Altair watched, frozen in a paralysis of fear, as Marcelo assaulted and then strangled his little brother. The killer squeezed the life out of the boy, and then, with a chilling calmness, turned to Altair and whispered a lie that was more terrifying than the truth. He told him, "He's just sleeping." But the horror wasn't over. Marcelo didn't flee. He didn't panic. After murdering Ivan, he turned his attention to Altair. But he didn't kill him immediately. Instead, a bizarre psychological hostage situation began. Marcelo, seemingly coming down from his violent high, began to treat Altair not as a witness to a murder, but as a companion. He spoke to the boy he had just traumatized, telling him they were going to be friends. He made Altair walk with him, leaving Ivan's body behind in the dirt. Imagine the psychological state of a 10-year-old boy in that moment. He has just watched his brother die. He is walking alongside the killer, deep in the middle of nowhere, knowing that at any second he could be next. Marcelo led him to a gas station to clean up, acting as if they were just father and son, or brothers. He washed the dirt off, methodical and calm. They spent that night sleeping in a thicket of brush. Altair lay awake, listening to the breathing of the man who killed his brother. Too terrified to run, too terrified to scream. The next morning, the nightmare continued. Marcelo decided they were going to Rio de Janeiro. He told Altair that he wanted the boy to live with him. He promised to take care of him. It was a twisted attempt at domestication. Altair, showing a survival instinct far beyond his years, played along. He nodded. He agreed. He pretended to be the compliant son Marcelo wanted. He knew his only chance of survival wasn't to fight, but to wait. He was looking for a single moment of distraction. He needed the vampire to blink, and as they navigated the morning crowds, moving toward Marcelo's workplace, where he distributed pamphlets, Altair saw his opening. The killer turned his head for just a second to grab his papers, and in that second, Altair ran. He ran for his life, carrying a story that would crack the city of Niterói wide open. When Altair sprinted away into the crowded streets of Niterói, he didn't just save his own life. He unknowingly started a chain reaction that would expose the darkest secrets the city had ever held. He managed to get home, shaken and traumatized, but the fear Marcelo had instilled in him was so deep that he didn't speak immediately. It took days. The silence of a traumatized child is a heavy thing. But eventually, the truth burst out. He told his family about the kind man who had turned into a demon, about the walk in the woods, and about his brother, Ivan, who was left behind in the dirt. When the police were finally notified, Altair did something incredibly brave. He led them back. He guided the officers not to a hidden lair, but to a mundane street corner where Marcelo was working, handing out flyers as if he hadn't just murdered a child days before. The arrest was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Marcelo didn't run. He didn't fight. When the police approached him, guided by the trembling finger of the surviving boy, Marcelo surrendered with an eerie calmness. But if the officers thought they were just closing the book on a single homicide, they were wrong. As soon as the interrogation began, the floodgates opened. Marcelo didn't deny the killing of Ivan Medeiros. In fact, he spoke about it with a disturbing lack of emotion, as if he were recounting a grocery list. And then, he kept talking. He began to outline a trail of bodies that stretched back months, revealing a catalog of horrors that seasoned detectives weren't ready to hear. To understand how a human being becomes capable of what Marcelo confessed to, you have to peel back the layers of his history. A history written in violence and neglect. Marcelo Costa de Andrade was a product of the very streets he hunted. Born into poverty in the Rosina favela, his life was a masterclass in misery. It wasn't just that he was poor, it was that he was unwanted. His childhood was defined by brutal physical abuse. He watched his father beat his mother, and in turn, he was beaten by almost everyone who was supposed to care for him. He was shipped off to grandparents in northeastern Brazil, who abused him, then bounced back to Rio, where his parents' new partners abused him further. He was a punching bag for the world. But the psychological break really began to fracture during his adolescence. He was sent to a boys' reformatory school, a place that was supposed to provide structure, but instead provided torture. He was an outcast, bullied relentlessly by the other boys, called retarded and soft. It was here, surrounded by the cruelty of other children, that a deep, simmering resentment began to boil. He was kicked out at 14 for aging out of the program, dumped back onto the streets with no skills, no support, and a mind that was slowly fracturing. He turned to prostitution to survive, and it was in this underworld that he was further victimized. Sexually abused by older men, reinforcing a cycle of dominance and submission that would later fuel his own crimes. By 1991, Marcelo had constructed a twisted reality to cope with his trauma. He had become obsessed with the universal church of the kingdom of God, but he warped the teachings to fit his broken psyche. He fixated on the idea of purity and salvation. In his interrogation, he explained his logic, and it was the logic of a nightmare. He believed that the boys on the street were destined for a life of suffering and sin, just like he had lived. By killing them while they were still young, he wasn't murdering them, he was sending them to heaven before they could be corrupted. He saw himself not as a serial killer, but as a divine filter. This delusion allowed him to commit acts of savagery that defy comprehension. The police listened in horror as he detailed the murders of at least 13 other boys. He described his modus operandi, which was always the same: finding vulnerable kids, usually street vendors or beggars, and offering them money or spiritual help. He lured them to caves, to the dense brush near the highways, or to deserted beaches. One of the cases he detailed was that of 11-year-old Altair Jose Muniz dos Santos. Marcelo had found him begging near a bus stop. He used the same lure, the promise of money. He took Altair to a soccer field surrounded by woods. When the boy couldn't satisfy Marcelo's sexual demands, the switch flipped. He strangled the child, but that wasn't enough to satisfy the rage he held against his own past. Marcelo told the police that after killing Altair, he went home, ate dinner, and then returned to the body later that night to decapitate it. He claimed this brutality was an act of vengeance against the boys who had bullied him in the reformatory. He was killing his past bullies over and over again through these innocent victims. But the moniker, the Vampire of Niterói, wasn't given to him just because he killed. It came from the death of another 11-year-old, Anderson Gomez Goulart. In this confession, the true depth of Marcelo's depravity came to light. He described crushing the boy's skull with a rock. As the child lay dying, Marcelo committed the act that would brand him forever. He drank the boy's blood. He told detectives he wanted to consume the life force of the victim. It was a mix of primitive superstition and unchecked sadism. He engaged in necrophilia, violating the bodies after death, treating them as objects for his own gratification, all while maintaining that he had done their souls a favor. The investigation revealed that Marcelo kept trophies. He revisited the crime scenes. He would go back to where he left the bodies to reposition them, to relive the control he had exerted. For months, he had operated in the shadows of Niterói, invisible because his victims were invisible. The police realized they weren't dealing with a criminal who feared the law. They were dealing with a man who believed he was above it, operating on a spiritual plane that only he could see. He had turned the forests of Niterói into a graveyard, and until Altair escaped, no one had even known to look. The detectives were now faced with the grim task of corroborating these stories, of walking into the woods with a monster and asking him to point out where the bones were buried. The search for the bodies wasn't a hunt. It was a guided tour into the abyss. Following his confession, Marcelo led detectives back into the dense, humid vegetation surrounding Niterói. He moved through the brush with a terrifying familiarity, pointing out locations as if he were remembering where he'd left a set of keys rather than where he had discarded a human being. The police were skeptical at first. Serial killers often exaggerate their body counts for notoriety, but the earth doesn't lie. One by one, the ground gave up its dead. Shallow graves, bones scattered by the elements, remains hidden in caves. The police were able to confirm 8 bodies, directly linked to his descriptions. Though Marcelo confessed to 14, the discrepancy likely wasn't because he was lying about the kills, but because the wilderness and the passage of time had claimed the others entirely. When the full scope of his atrocities hit the Brazilian press, the public outcry was deafening. But the justice system faced a complex dilemma. In the United States, a man like Marcelo would be looking at multiple life sentences without parole, or perhaps the death penalty in certain states. But Brazil is different. The Brazilian Constitution forbids life imprisonment and capital punishment. Furthermore, the legal system had to determine if Marcelo was a criminal or a patient. Was he evil or was he sick? The psychiatric evaluations were chilling. The doctors didn't find a man faking insanity to avoid prison. They found a man whose reality was fundamentally broken. Marcelo was diagnosed as a sociopath with schizoid features, completely devoid of empathy or remorse. But the most disturbing part was his consistency. He never wavered from his story. He wasn't sorry for killing those boys because, in his mind, he hadn't hurt them. He had saved them. He genuinely believed that by intercepting their lives before adulthood, he had secured their entry into heaven. Because of this profound mental disconnect, the courts declared him inimputable. This meant he couldn't be held criminally responsible for his actions because he didn't understand their illicit nature. Instead of a maximum security penitentiary, Marcelo was sent to a forensic psychiatric hospital, a manicomio judicial. Technically, he wasn't sentenced to prison. He was sentenced to an indefinite security measure for treatment. And this is where the story shifts from a historical tragedy to a modern-day anxiety. For over 3 decades, the Vampire of Niterói has lived inside the walls of institutions like the Henrique Roxo Hospital of Custody and Psychiatric Treatment. Inside, he is a ghost. He spends his time reading the Bible, still obsessive, still convinced of his own righteousness. There are reports that he engages in the same unsettling behaviors he did as a free man, like listening to recordings of children crying, or strictly adhering to his warped religious rituals. He doesn't fight with guards, he doesn't try to escape, he waits. The terror for the Brazilian public was reignited in 2017. Under Brazilian law, there is a complex debate about how long someone can be held at the time. The maximum time a person could be deprived of liberty was 30 years, recently updated to 40, but the old laws applied to him. His defense team argued that since he had served nearly 3 decades, he should be released. They petitioned for a progressive release, a stepping stone back into society. The very idea sent a shockwave through the community. The prosecutors fought back hard, arguing that the 30-year limit applies to sentences, not medical treatments. As long as he remains a danger to society, he must stay locked up, and he is dangerous. The medical reports from 2017 and subsequent evaluations have been unanimous and damning. They describe a man with an incurable mental illness and 0 chance of rehabilitation. One psychiatrist stated bluntly that he should never be released under any circumstances. Why? Because he still brags about the crimes. He recounts the murders with a sense of pride, smiling as he remembers the details. He has no concept of the pain he caused the families. He only sees the glory of his own actions. If he were released today, there is a statistical certainty that he would kill. Again, his logic remains intact. The world is sinful. Children must be saved, and he is the instrument of that salvation. As of the most recent updates, Marcelo remains in custody, caught in a legal and medical limbo. The psychiatric hospitals in Brazil are undergoing changes with a movement to close these asylum-style institutions, raising the terrifying question of where men like Marcelo will go. For now, the system holds him, but every few years, the legal clock ticks and the possibility of his release floats back into the headlines, reminding the families of the victims that their nightmare isn't buried, it's just institutionalized. When we look back at the case of the Vampire of Niterói, we aren't just looking at the brutality of a single man. We are looking at a failure of the collective safety net. Marcelo Costa de Andrade was a monster made, not just born. He was forged in the violence of the favela, hardened by the abuse of the reformatory system, and ignored by a society that didn't care to look too closely at a man lurking in the shadows. But more than that, he is a reminder of the vulnerability of the invisible. He hunted boys who were already slipping through the cracks, the poor, the hungry, the wanderers. He exploited their need for a meal or a kind word to lead them to their deaths. Today, the woods near the Barreto Viaduct have overgrown the scenes of the crimes. The traffic still roars by on the highway, drivers oblivious to the horror that happened just yards away in the darkness. But for the families of the 14 boys, and likely more who were never found, the silence of the forest is deafening. Marcelo Costa de Andrade sits in a cell, reading his Bible, waiting for a heaven that he tried to build with blood. He is a living relic of a terrifying time, a man who believed he was an angel, but who proved that the devil doesn't live in hell. He lives right here, walking among us, wearing the mask of a quiet, polite stranger,